What is going on, everybody? It is Treeb from Treeb Talks here, and we are back talking about Kill Tony, and we are going to be going through the month of July and the episodes, and going through some of the panelists, actually all of the panelists for the month of July, and ranking them from worst to best. Now, in a case where there are more than one guest, we are going to be ranking those guys individually, not as a whole in the episode. That is going to be a video for another day. We are going to be judging these individual panelists as a whole and how well they did during their time on Kill Tony. During that specific episode, did they have some funny bits? Did they improve the episode? And were they worth a spot on one of the internet's best shows, one of the best podcasts in the world? We will figure it out. And in the month of July, there were 12 guests in a 5-episode span of Kill Tony. And let's start things off with the 12th best guest on this month of Kill Tony, and that was Kevin Ryan on episode 671. Now, in these episodes of Kill Tony, when there are more than one panelist, more than two usually, it's a little bit hard for everybody to kind of get a word in. And when I looked at this list and I looked at these guests, I could not really remember a big moment for Kevin Ryan in his episode of Kill Tony number 671. And I couldn't remember a moment that he made me laugh, a moment that was memorable, and therefore I had to put him at the bottom of the list. And again, when you have 4 people on a podcast, especially guys like Foley, Ari Shaffir, as well as Mark Norman, who are on that podcast, it's going to be hard to kind of get a word in edgewise and to kind of stand out above the rest, especially when it's such a star-studded group on an episode of Kill Tony. So, unfortunately, Kevin Ryan, for me, comes in at number 12 for his appearance on Kill Tony number 671. Coming in at number 11, I have Joe Rogan for his appearance on 673. Joe Rogan didn't do a whole lot for me on his appearance on Kill Tony. I think he was rather quiet. He didn't really have a whole lot of zingers either. Kind of just really used his facial expressions to kind of carry his appearance on Kill Tony this go around. I'm not really a huge fan anytime Joe comes on to the show, because he either gets way too drunk and is pretty annoying, or he's kind of just furniture and plays second fiddle to whoever he brings along with him. And I think that was the case in his most recent episode. It was the case when he brought on Post Malone not that long ago, and it just seems like he's a guy that has done this show so many times that he feels like he doesn't have to contribute too much, and that was the case here. Joe Rogan, not a very memorable performance by him, wasn't too funny, and I had to give him the 11th spot, the second worst guest this month in July for Kill Tony. And coming in at number 10, his guy that he came on with, Matt McCusker, in 673, is going to get the number 10 spot for me. That was probably the worst episode of the month, him and Joe Rogan. Neither one of them really stood out to me. Matt definitely had a little bit more of fun there. He definitely contributed a little bit more, but it seemed like Tony and Red Band were kind of doing the most work in that episode of the podcast. Joe and Matt were kind of just there. They didn't do a whole heck of a lot to add value to that episode, and it was kind of a shame, because when you see those two are on the podcast, two of the more premier comedians, at least in the podcasting game. I think Matt's a better comedian than Joe, obviously, but in the podcasting game, in the stand-up game, when it comes to Matt, you kind of expect a better podcast, maybe a better showing from these two guys, but we didn't really get that, and it's a shame, because this month really kind of produced some really great episodes of Kill Tony, and it was probably the worst episode of the month of July. Coming in at number 9, I have H. Foley for his appearance on 671, and again, there was 4 people on this podcast. Kind of hard to make yourself known when there's so many guests, but when he did have a spot, he did kind of make the most of it. A lot of funny fat jokes, a lot of funny screaming moments. I think H. Foley did what he had to do without being too overbearing. When he was on the podcast with a lot of heavy hitters, with Ari Shaffir, Mark Norman, Kevin Ryan, he obviously did a lot better than his podcast brother, Mr. Ryan. Had a lot more memorable moments, at least for me, and that's why he comes in at number 9. Coming in at number 8 for me, I have Ari Madison and his appearance on 674. He's coming to his own as a comedian, and he's doing it very, very quickly. And the fact that Tony had him as a panelist so early on in his career shows trust, shows that he wants him to stick around, shows that he wants him to be a regular for a long time, and is a guy that he wants to stick around. And he didn't do too much. He wasn't chasing moments. He was going out there and he was, picking his spots and really making the people laugh. Like when the transsexual woman came on, and I cannot think of her name right now, but it was the one of the most funny parts of the entire show, other than when the scooper gimmick, that scooper guy came on. He said, America is crazy, or America is awesome, and that popped the whole crowd. That was hilarious, and he did a great job picking his spots and going after it. So I got to give Ari Madison the 8th spot for the best guest in the month of July. Coming in at number 7, I have Shane Gillis in episode 670. Shane Gillis is always going to be a good a good panelist. He's going to be a guy that's going to be up for Guest of the Year every year, and he probably will be up for Guest of the Year this year as well. A lot of people will say that he carried this episode. I will say that the guy that he brought on, a relatively unknown comedian up to this point, I think kind of did a better job and was a little bit more funny than him, and we'll get to him in a minute. But Shane Gillis, an overall solid performance on that episode, and you can't really ask for more out of Shane. Obviously, he had another appearance that is going to rank higher than this one, so stay tuned for that. But Shane Gillis and his performance at Kill Tony number 670 earns him a spot at number 7 on the list. Coming in at number 6, I have Mark Norman at 671, and there's not a more consistent podcast guest. There's not a more consistent Kill Tony guest, as Andrew agrees. His first appearance on the podcast on the Treeb Talks show, and there's Noodle chilling in the background, obviously our most esteemed co-host on the show. But Mark Norman, he's always going to be there providing the jokes, providing the laughs, and it's going to be a steady presence no matter what. And he was that again in his appearance on 671, and even with a bigger cast of people, which it seems like he's always on. Very rarely is he coming on just by himself. He's on with everybody kind of from the Rogan sphere, and he delivers every time. So I think a perfect spot for him is right in the middle of the list for the July episodes, and his performance on 671. Coming in at number 5, I have Ari Shaffir. Now, Ari Shaffir and his performance on 671 is basically based off of his whole gimmick, right? Ari Shaffir is a guy who I don't think is a very funny stand-up comedian. I think typically he's goofy. He's not that funny. I think he kind of dives into his shock value thing a little bit too much. Obviously showed his dick at the forum, which, what are you going to do? I mean, that's kind of his thing. But his whole, dressing up like a detective pretty much and saying, oh, I'm a changed man, this and that, and basically acting like a pedophile like the whole time, that was hilarious. He was funny. He was knocking it out of the park this whole entire episode, and he definitely deserved a spot high on the list for how well he delivered on his episode of the podcast. Coming in at number 4 for me is the guy that was co-hosting with Shane Gillis on episode 670, James McCann. James McCann's hilarious, dude. Like, after his podcast with Shane Gillis, I looked up some of his work. He's a funny guy, and I think he was funnier than Shane, call me crazy, on that podcast, and just had a lot of memorable moments for me, and is a guy that I would love to see back on the podcast. He's a guy that I'm going to be seeing live here in a couple of weeks, actually, in Spokane. He's going to be opening up for Shane Gillis, and I'm very excited for that. And wouldn't have been as excited to see him if it wasn't for the Kill Tony episode, if it wasn't for the podcast. And I think he's a guy that if he comes back onto the show, either by himself or again with Shane, he has every opportunity in the world to deliver. Coming in at number 3, and I think a guy that is, him, Shane, and Harlan Williams right now, I think are in a 3-way race to win Guest of the Year. I have Sam Talon. I was rolling, laughing my ass off at Sam Talon's episode with Ari Maddy. He is such a funny guy and is a great stand-up comedian too, if you've never sought out his work. Such a funny guy, such a talent, no pun intended, but he's a guy that is always going to deliver on every facet on Kill Tony. The jokes, the improv with the scooper act, and Luigi is afraid of it. Mario wants to escape it. This helps me from not killing myself. And just what he was doing with the transsexual Phoenix, that's what her name was, Phoenix. Hilarious stuff. Basically, going back and forth, acting like he wanted to hook up with her. Like, hilarious stuff. And Sam Talon, man, he's a guy that I would love to have on my screens all the time on Kill Tony. And very excited to see him back on the show. And my top 2, I think, are no surprise, but what order do I have them in? At number 2, I have Adam Ray as Joe Biden, and at number 1, I have Shane Gillis as Donald Trump. That was probably the best episode of Kill Tony ever, maybe, I think. Has to be. It's what got a lot of people talking about Kill Tony. Obviously, Kill Tony's been a show that's been growing in the last year, but that episode really, brought the general public to the show, and it was just so funny. Like, so many marquee moments. Shane Gillis's impression of Donald Trump kind of pushes it over the edge for me, giving him the number 1 spot, and how funny he was when he broke character. Time and time again, when he broke, it made it even more funny, and I think that's what pushes him to the number 1 spot. But, Adam Ray, obviously, the improv and the, impressions is his thing, so he's always going to be funny, and he did a great Joe Biden, and the fact that these two, had really never met before the podcast. They had great chemistry up there on stage, and we're just a hilarious duo, and we're great pairing. And, it's going to be a podcast people go back and watch and listen to, a million times. The bucket pulls were awful, but those two made the podcast, and it was great, a great overall edition of Kill Tony. Tell me who you guys think was the best guest on the show for the month of July. I'm sorry if the energy levels are a little low. Didn't get a whole lot of sleep last night, and we are doing these on a lunch break. And, hopefully tomorrow we'll come back with a little bit more energy. Thank you guys again for tuning in to another episode of Treeb Talks. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day.